Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. As today, we talk about a period in the late 18-teens and early 1820s when, for the most part, Americans were getting along. Don't worry, it won't last. Now, the War of 1812 is sometimes described as the Second War of American Independence, and it created a sense of national pride and a national unity, except possibly for some New Englanders, and gave us a new generation of war heroes, as the Revolutionary generation was fading away. There was old Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, Oliver Hazard Perry, who in the Battle of Lake Erie met the enemy, and they were his. Thomas Macdonough won the victory on Lake Champlain. The defenders of Fort McHenry gave us what would become our national anthem. And of course, old Hickory was the hero of New Orleans. And so, for a new generation of Americans and American politicians, building a strong nation was a way to express politically this sense of nationalism, replacing, at least for some, at least for a time, the typical sense of a first loyalty being to one state. The most prominent of these new nationalists was that war hawk from Kentucky, Henry Clay, nicknamed Harry of the West. And over time, he would come to propose what he would eventually call the American system, a term we're getting a little ahead of ourselves and using in the late 18-teens, but it's how his plans are remembered. And although he began as a Jeffersonian Republican, as everyone did after the Federalists collapsed in the aftermath of the Hartford Convention, the plan he devised would have made Alexander Hamilton proud. To strengthen America's economy, he would promote American industry. Our infant industries, of course, could not compete with the cheap British goods being dumped on the American market now that peace had come. And he was among many nationalist congressmen, even some who would later change their views on such things, who supported a much higher tariff in 1816. Indeed, the Tariff of 1816 was the first truly protective tariff in American history, with rates on many goods as high as 20 or 25%, hoping to tax foreign goods so much people would be forced to buy American. To help stabilize the economy, Clay and other nationalists chartered a second Bank of the United States in 1816 to replace the first bank whose charter had been allowed to expire in 1811. It was based in Philadelphia, but eventually had 25 branches across the country. Not only would it give the U.S. Treasury somewhere to invest its money at interest, but that money could be lent out to prospective businessmen, and the bank could issue paper money, a reliable, stable paper money, implicitly backed by the deposits of the U.S. Treasury. Clay and some other nationalists also hoped that the wealth that this tariff, and especially the growth of our industry, would generate could be used to bind the country together through a system of what were then typically called internal improvements, what today we would probably call public works or infrastructure. He particularly wanted roads to link the country together, and where possible, canals. These would promote trade, which it was felt would benefit everyone. It would also link the East with the West, these internal improvements thus holding the country together, while also letting more people move west, and promoting trade, again, for everybody. Plus, in a case of emergency, better roads would make it easier to move troops and supplies to the frontier or wherever they might be needed, something that had often been very hard to do during the War of 1812, especially in the Northwest. But even the era of nationalism that prevailed right after the War of 1812, these plans for internal improvement struck many people as a bit too much. Some people, for various reasons, felt it wasn't fair that national funds would be spent to benefit the particular areas where roads would be built. I mean, to be sure, Clay wanted to build them all over the place, but nonetheless, most would have ended up going west which many Easterners, especially in New England, already worried about losing population to the West and thus influence in the House of Representatives, just didn't seem to benefit them as much. Even for Westerners, who might see a road built in one part of their state but not others, or in another Western state but not theirs, again felt this was everyone's money, or more specifically, their money, benefiting certain regions and maybe not theirs. Besides, many Jeffersonian Republicans felt that using national funds on local improvements was a violation of the Constitution, an intrusion upon the rights of the states. And for the most part, federal funds did not end up getting spent on projects like this. Although there were a few, most notably the National Road, sometimes called the Cumberland Road because it began in Cumberland, Maryland, indeed on the roadbed laid by General Braddock in the French and Indian War. Construction began in 1811 and would continue in stages until finally reaching Illinois in the late 1830s. One attempt to link the East to the West, but one of very few, really the only major one, to be built by the U.S. government. So instead of waiting for federal funds, states and sometimes private companies, indeed often private companies, built their own internal improvements, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. As we'll talk about more here in a few days, one of the most notable of these was the Erie Canal, built in New York State by that state's government to link Lake Erie with Albany on the Hudson River, and along the Hudson River to New York Harbor, in connecting the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes. Other states borrowed money to build roads and canals that often were not finished, or when they were, did not pay for themselves, which created further distrust of government spending on large public projects in some places, especially in the South, where such schemes often failed. And while the Second American Revolution did produce a new crop of national heroes, the years immediately afterwards were supervised by the last of the heroes of the American Revolution. Now in 1816, James Madison declared that if 2 terms had been good enough for George Washington, it was good enough for him, and retired to his plantation at Montpelier, Virginia. And the Jeffersonian Republicans nominated to replace him James Monroe, the last of the Virginia dynasty, as they were sometimes called. Monroe was a veteran of the American Revolution. He had crossed the Delaware with Washington, been wounded by the Hessians at Trenton. He had helped to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, had served as Madison's Secretary of State, a role that was coming to be seen as sort of a stepping stone to the presidency. Indeed, to remind Americans as his status as the last of the revolutionary presidents, he still wore a cocked hat and knee breeches, a decade or two after they had gone out of fashion everywhere else, dressing as if he was still fighting the Revolutionary War. And although some Federalists did oppose him in 1816, Monroe very soundly defeated Rufus King of New York 183 to 34 in the Electoral College. And the Federalists never ran a national candidate again. All they did hold some state and local offices well into the 1820s in the Northeast. With the Federalists fading fast, Monroe made a real effort to reconcile the different regions of the country, making a nationwide goodwill tour in 1817, visiting all parts of the country, most notably New England. And in this time, America seemed to be entering an era of good feelings, in which two-party politics seemed like a thing of the past, and the first two-party system of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans came to an end. In the election of 1820, Monroe was re-elected with every electoral vote but one. It's sometimes said that one elector felt that only Washington should be elected unanimously, and so threw his vote. In reality, there was one guy from New Hampshire who just didn't like Monroe that much and cast his vote for John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State. All the air of good feelings did not, in fact, feel good for everybody, and several of the efforts to tie the country together seemed to be backfiring. Now, as Americans moved west, many wanted to buy up cheap western land, and often speculating that they could resell it later to other settlers at a profit, buy the land cheap, and sell it again. And the Bank of the United States helped out with this, lending money to speculators who borrowed money from its western branches. Smaller and less stable banks also lent a lot of money to speculators, buying large tracts of land on credit, and also just by printing large sums of paper money, which was often not backed by specie. Even the U.S. government encouraged speculation, offering to sell 160 acres of land, a quarter section under the old township and range system, at just $2 an acre. And furthermore, allowing buyers to pay just 1/4 of that value up front and the rest over 4 years. And so lots of farmers and lots of speculators bought lots of land on credit and built up lots of debt. And then in 1817, a crisis hit as crop prices collapsed around the world. During the Napoleonic Wars, crop prices had gone up. A lot of farmers were off fighting, and so governments bought a lot of food at high prices to feed their armies. Once the war was over, many of those soldiers went back to their fields. Furthermore, Europe had some terrible weather. Right after the War of 1812, many farmers could not produce enough food, and American farmers were happy to sell it to them at high prices. But in 1817, again, the weather improved, the war was over, and crop prices collapsed. Furthermore, cotton, which we'll talk a lot more about later on, had become an important American product and an important export to Britain. But Britain now started buying a lot of cotton from India, which was cheaper and easier to control. And so, in 1819, a major financial crisis set in, called the Panic of 1819. And so, as many farmers were unable to pay off their debts, they began to default on their loans. The Bank of the United States began refusing to accept paper money printed by small banks and demanded payment in specie, which of course was rare. Many farms were foreclosed on by state banks and the Bank of the United States. Many southern and western banks in particular simply collapsed. And southerners and westerners came to really distrust banks, especially the Bank of the United States, which they blamed for calling in loans and making it hard to pay off existing loans, again by demanding the use of paper money. Again, the Bank of the United States had been meant to promote economic stability, but in this crisis, it probably made things a bit worse. Some people came to blame paper money itself for causing the panic, saying that too many banks had printed too much paper money, it had become too easy to go into debt. And there were a couple responses. Congress passed the Land Act of 1820 in hopes of pleasing Westerners by making it even easier to buy land. You could buy 80 acres of land, a half-quarter section, for $1.25 an acre, but you did have to pay cash. And expansion into the West also brought about our first great national crisis in peacetime. And this came in 1819 when the territory of Missouri requested admission as a state. And in the state constitution they submitted to Congress, slavery would have been permitted by the state constitution, in contrast to the states carved out of the Northwest Territory. And by this point, an anti-slavery movement was growing. It was still fairly small and still seen as fairly radical, but it was pretty vocal, especially in New York and New England and Pennsylvania. And furthermore, although the North was growing in population more quickly than the South, and was becoming the dominant force in the House of Representatives. There had always been an equal number of slave-owning states and free states, at this point 11 of each, so that in the Senate the two regions were balanced, every state having an equal number of senators, that being 2. Some Northerners, especially New Englanders, resented this, feeling it gave the South more power than, and the West too, more power than their population warranted. Again, when Missouri hoped to enter the Union as a slave state, an anti-slavery congressman from New York named James Tallmadge proposed an amendment to the bill that would have granted Missouri statehood. This Tallmadge Amendment would have prohibited bringing any new slaves into the state of Missouri. If you already owned slaves, they were yours and that was that, but no more would be brought in. And furthermore, all children born to slaves in the state of Missouri would be born free, a method of gradual emancipation a number of northern states had already used, not freeing existing slaves, but guaranteeing that slaves' children would not be slaves themselves. This infuriated Southerners. They felt it was an attack on their economic and social system, and threatened the compromises between North and South that had lasted at least since the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitutional Convention. And the anger that this stirred up frightened many Americans, fearing it had endangered our republic, which was still young and fragile, despite the victory in the War of 1812 and the sense of nationalism the war had created. Thomas Jefferson, old but still alive in Virginia, said this was like a fire bell in the night that filled him with terror. But just as it happened in 1787, a compromise was reached, in large part due to Henry Clay, who historians have come to remember as the Great Compromiser, crafting here the first of 3 major compromises in his career. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state, but to balance it out, at last gave Maine its independence from Massachusetts as a free state, balancing things out at 12-12. And the balance would remain for years to come. The tradition was that whenever a new state entered the Union, in either the North or the South, another state would enter to balance it out the same year or the next year in the South or the North. And furthermore, so we would never, ever have to argue about this again, ever, it was declared that the southern border of Mississippi, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, would become the northern boundary of slavery. New states created south of that line would automatically allow slavery. Those created north of it would not. And this compromise would keep the balance between North and South intact for 30 years. Now, beyond the general admiration for President Monroe and the nationalism created by the War of 1812 and the compromise crafted by Henry Clay, there was another force for national unity and power that stood above all others, the Supreme Court, under the leadership of the last Federalist, John Marshall. Now, John Marshall stood through a strong central government for his whole career on the bench, a very long career. Of course, his ruling in the case of Marbury versus Madison had established the precedent of judicial review. And with that power, the Supreme Court established many other legal precedents that secured the authority of the national government. Now, in Maryland, the state legislature created a tax in 1818 that could be levied on all banks in Maryland that had their headquarters in another state. Except there was really only one bank in Maryland that had its headquarters in another state, and that was the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States. And many Republicans, especially many Southern Republicans, distrusted. So a tax essentially to hurt the Bank of the United States, but James McCulloch, the director of the Baltimore branch, refused to pay the tax and was sued by the state of Maryland, which went to the Supreme Court. In the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court ruled that the necessary and proper clause of the U.S. Constitution gave Congress the power to create a national bank. Again, something Jeffersonian Republicans had argued against at certain times. And furthermore, due to the Supremacy Clause, states had no power to tax a federal institution, confirming in a couple different ways the supremacy of the national government and the power of the Elastic Clause. Now, lotteries were once a common form of fundraising, and it happened that in Virginia, a couple brothers of the name Cohen had run a lottery, which was apparently run illegally under the laws of Virginia. So they were convicted of illegally selling lottery tickets by the Virginia courts, but they appealed to the Supreme Court. The court decided in favor of Virginia. So, seems like a victory for Virginia, and is in this case, but the fact that the Supreme Court made a decision at all and that it stuck showed that the Supreme Court was superior to state courts. Because the appeal was made at all, and a decision made and a decision followed, the Supreme Court would have the power to do the same in the future. Now, a newly important industry in the early 1800s was steamboats. Robert Livingston, who had been the Second Continental Congress and negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, had funded the development of the first successful steamboat, actually developed by Robert Fulton. And we'll talk more about those things later on. As a reward for this, they were given a monopoly on steamboat use in the state of New York, where Livingston lived. They're sort of like a patent, a monopoly to reward them for the risks and investment they took in creating a steamboat. Now, they did not actually run all the steamboats in New York. They could license out that right on particular routes. And they had licensed one route, or probably more than one route, to Aaron Ogden. The case that mattered was a route he operated between New Jersey and New York. But a former business partner of Ogden, a man named Thomas Gibbons, began to operate another route, or another steamboat on the same line, violating that license. Gibbons, by the way, was assisted by a young man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who's going to go on to make a fortune in transportation. In any case, Ogden sued Gibbons and won in the New York courts. But Gibbons challenged that, and it went to the Supreme Court in 1824 in Gibbons versus Ogden. And here, the Supreme Court looked at a map and noticed that a route going from New York to New Jersey crossed state lines. And one group and one group only can regulate interstate commerce. That, of course, being Congress. And so New York could not grant a monopoly on this particular route because it crossed state lines, thus demonstrating the power of the Commerce Clause, which of course would be very important in congressional power in the future. Now, stepping all the way back to 1795, Georgia had in that year sold a large tract of western land covering most of modern Alabama and Mississippi, where Georgia still had land claims, for the price of 1.4 cents an acre, which even then was awfully, awfully cheap. This was known as the Yazoo Land Act, after the Yazoo River, which ran through the area, but also known as the Yazoo Fraud, because legislators had passed this very generous law in exchange for bribes from speculators who bought the land up cheap, because they knew the law was going to be passed before most people did. Average Georgians felt cheated. They didn't get the chance to buy land cheaply themselves, and a huge source of potential income for Georgia, the sale of this land, was lost. Plus, it was legally questionable. A lot of that area was in land reserved for American Indians under the protection of Congress. Some was also claimed by Spain. And so in the next election, a new batch of legislators were elected to overturn the law, which they did, and tried to reclaim that land. But some of the speculators who had bought the land said they were being cheated out of land they had bought under the letter of the law. Two of those speculators were Robert Fletcher and John Peck. And the background's a little complicated, not that important. Peck had sold Fletcher land claimed by Indians, and thus that he probably couldn't sell, even though he'd bought it under the Yazoo Land Act. Fletcher sued Peck for that. In fact, Peck hoped he would lose, because if he did, Fletcher hoped he would lose, because if Fletcher lost, that meant Peck did have the right to sell Indian land, thus basically stripping Indians of their claim to land. Again, the details aren't that important. What matters, though, is that when this case reached the Supreme Court in 1810, the Marshall Court upheld the original law and the land purchases. Sure, it was a bad law, but once made and once land was sold under it, those sales were a contract, and state governments do not have the right to violate a contract. Indeed, the inviolability of a contract is an important part of business and the rule of law in America. Not like some European countries where the king could simply seize whatever you owned or take over your business if it was profitable and he needed the money. And a similar issue arose a bit later in New Hampshire, where Dartmouth College had a charter as a private school, a charter granted to it forever by King George III all the way back in 1769. But the thing is, by the early 1800s, many states were founding their own state colleges and universities. And New Hampshire wanted one too, but figured rather than found one, they just take over the one they already had. And so New Hampshire tried to take over the right to appoint the college president, the board of trustees, and other officials, essentially making Dartmouth a state school in 1816. Dartmouth wanted to remain in control of themselves and hired their most distinguished alumnus to represent them, the great lawyer Daniel Webster. He was eloquent in court. In the case of Dartmouth versus Woodward, he told the justice, "It is a small college, and yet there are those who love it." And in the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward, he successfully argued that the charter was a legal contract that could not be violated by the state, and partly based on the precedent of Fletcher versus Peck, the court supported him. Again, upholding the inviolability of contracts, and also setting a precedent that a corporation, in this case the college, could, in some cases, such as a lawsuit, act as a person in its own right. And so the idea that a corporation is legally a person would be very important in American business and law in years to come. Later on, Daniel Webster went on to become a senator from Massachusetts, an outspoken supporter of the power of the national government, which he defended so often and so eloquently, he was known to some as the godlike Daniel Webster. And he and John Marshall would be two of the most important forces in building a strong national Hamiltonian government long after the death of both Hamilton and his original opponents, these two men, and of course Henry Clay. And in this era of nationalism, another major accomplishment was securing our nation's borders. Now, the Russo-American Treaty of 1817 limited the number of warships that the U.S. and Great Britain could keep on the Great Lakes. The Treaty of 1818, also sometimes called the Convention of 1818, settled the border between the U.S. and Canada at the 49th parallel, or at least one portion of it was settled along that line, 49 degrees north latitude, at least setting the boundary between Louisiana and British North America. And there is also an agreement that the U.S. and Britain would jointly occupy the Oregon country, neither one staking an exclusive claim to it. And elsewhere, our western border was also more secure. New Spain was too sparsely populated, the Spanish Empire too weak to threaten the frontier in the Great American Desert and the Rocky Mountains. Although to the south, in Spanish Florida, things were different. There, the Spanish, and also the British, who were very involved in Florida despite officially having given it up in 1783, and American Indians were a threat to American security. Now, in the 17 and 1800s, as European and American settlers pushed into the Deep South, they fought with and displaced many native peoples, many of whom fled to Florida. Among these were the Yamasee, who had originally lived in and around South Carolina, the Lower Creek Indians as well, mostly living in Georgia, and some others, some Cherokee, some Upper Creek, some Choctaw, and more. And also, some runaway slaves joined these various Indians seeking refuge in Florida. And eventually, these various Indians and escaped slaves merged into one large group the Spanish called Cimarrons, meaning runaways or wild men, and which the Indians came to pronounce Seminole. Along the border between the United States and Florida, local white people and local Indians often made small raids against each other, mostly to steal livestock, although white people would kill Indians fairly frequently. Indians of the Seminole tribe, in many of whom were slaves or had slave ancestors, tried to free slaves from white-owned plantations. And it's worth pointing out that for most American Indians, race was not viewed as that big a deal, at least in a way that Americans and Europeans often saw it. For them, it was about loyalty to the tribe, not about skin color or ethnicity, in most cases. So if you basically were loyal to a tribe, adopted its customs and culture, and followed its authority, they were welcome to see you as a member of the tribe. The time would come, in fact, when most Cherokee leaders were by blood predominantly Scottish, but Cherokee by law and in their hearts. So there's raids along the border between Florida and the United States. The Seminole finally went too far. This is not pictured here, but it does picture the idea that the British encouraged these and other raids by Indians. Any case, in February of 1817, Seminole Indians killed a woman named Mrs. Garrett and her two children, one 3 years old, the others only 2 months old. Not long afterwards, an American ship sailing to Fort Scott in Georgia, but through Spanish Florida, was attacked, and a number of people on board, women, children, and sick soldiers, were killed in the so-called Fort Scott massacre. America blamed Britain for this as well, in saying they encouraged, or at least did nothing to stop, Seminole raids on the United States. And so we call on one of our great military heroes, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, to pursue the Seminole. And following the principle of hot pursuit, he chased them all the way into Florida, with 800 U.S. soldiers, 1,000 Tennessee militia, 1,000 Georgia militia, and some Creek Indians allied with him. On April 6, 1816, he seized the Spanish fort at St. Mark's, where he arrested 2 British subjects and accused them of selling guns to the Indians. One was a Scottish merchant named George Arbuthnot, whom they ended up hanging from the yardarm of his own ship. The other was an ex-Royal Marine named Robert Ambrister, who was ultimately sentenced to death by firing squad. From there, Jackson marched to Pensacola and occupied that on May 27, 1818. The Spanish surrendered the fort just outside town the next day. Jackson went back home, leaving one of his officers in charge of Pensacola. The Spanish and the British were outraged, but neither wanted a war with the United States at that time. The U.S. were still too important to British trade, and Spain was busy fighting to try to hold on to its other American colonies, most of which had begun declaring independence while Spain was occupied by the French during the Napoleonic Wars. Some having resented Spain for some time, others resenting the new laws passed by the new monarch of Spain, the brother of Emperor Napoleon. Now, there were those American politicians who were outraged too, mad that Andrew Jackson has sparked an international incident and exceeded the scope of his orders from the War Department. Some members of Congress, including the very vocal Henry Clay, as well as several members of President Monroe's cabinet, including the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, who was angry that Jackson had exceeded his orders, wanted to censure Jackson, to enter an official criticism of him in the congressional record. But most Americans viewed him as a hero, not just for his victories in the War of 1812, but now for his victory in Florida. Indeed, he was later made governor of Florida as a reward, or maybe a punishment. He only stayed 3 months. Plus, the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, supported Jackson quietly and opposed the censure of him, because he saw an opportunity. Indeed, having shown how easily the U.S. could invade Florida, we soon convinced them to sell. In 1819, John Quincy Adams and Luis Dionis González Vara of Spain negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty. And you'll see different years attached to this. Sometimes 1819, when it was negotiated, sometimes 1820, when Spain officially agreed to it, sometimes 1821, when the U.S. Senate officially confirmed it. In any case, the Adams-Onis Treaty ceded Florida to the United States in exchange for the United States paying off debts owed by Spain to Americans up to $5 million. Most of that to insurance companies, actually. So even though we paid $5 million, we were really paying that to ourselves. This also fixed the boundary between New Spain and the United States, and left the Oregon country clearly outside the Spanish Empire, despite their earlier vague claims to it. When Mexico got their independence not long afterwards, they agreed to the same border. Indeed, as Spain's colonies in the New World, aside from, for the moment, its Caribbean islands, won their independence in the late 18-teens and early 1820s, the United States and Britain worried that Spain might one day try to reclaim them, or that some other European power might try to step in. So the British Foreign Minister proposed that together the two English-speaking peoples insist that the independent Latin American republics be left alone by everyone, and thus open to free trade by the British and the United States. However, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and President James Monroe felt this alliance was inappropriate, that America shouldn't be teaming up with Britain. Also, we really didn't need to work with them, especially after our Second War for Independence. We would make this pledge to protect the independence of these republics alone. And so in December of 1823, when James Monroe sent his annual message to Congress, it included a warning to the great powers of Europe, and although it would be named for James Monroe, it was largely written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and would come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. In this Monroe Doctrine, Monroe asserted that European powers could not claim any more land in the New World, nor intervene to reclaim any lost colonies, or to otherwise get involved in any independent country in the New World. If they still have colonies, that's their business, but they're not taking back any they lost or taking any new ones. Implicitly, in return, the U.S. would not intervene in any conflicts in Europe. The Western Hemisphere is ours, but we'll stay out of everything else. This is a matter both of solidarity with fellow republics who, like America, had won their independence from a European empire. This is also an attempt to limit European expansion into vulnerable territories where they might threaten American interests. And Monroe may have particularly had in mind the Empire of Russia, which had declared itself the open foe of democracy, had promised to assist anyone trying to suppress the development of a republic them having very painful memories of what the French had been up to in recent decades. And furthermore, Russia was expanding down the west coast of North America, with trading posts almost as far south as San Francisco Bay, and definite claims well into the Oregon country. But in 1824, the Tsar of Russia agreed to the Russo-American Treaty of 1824, which fixed Russia's border with America at 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude. So that would be the southern tip of Russian America, although Russia did retain trading rights below that line. So the Oregon country, at least, will be jointly and happily shared by the U.S. and the United Kingdom. Now, in 1824, James Monroe felt that 2 terms having been good enough for George Washington, it was good enough for him, and made plans to retire to Virginia. And now the question is, who would be next? The obvious choice might seem to be his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, but there was definite interest among other members of his cabinet too. Adams was from Massachusetts. From Georgia came William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary of War John C. Calhoun from South Carolina was interested in the office, as was Henry Clay from Kentucky, now Speaker of the House of Representatives, and there was a senator from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, and all of them expressed their interest in the presidency, and the contest between them would be very bitter indeed. With the revolutionary generation passing away, the era of good feelings had come to an end, and party politics was returning to America.